Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome to What Moves You.
So officially, I want to welcome you, Emily, to What Moves You. Thank you so much for being here today. And honestly, this has been a long time coming. I feel like I have so many questions, and I wrote them all down just for the sake of not forgetting them, because I feel like this is what you do, your line of work specifically, I feel is a topic that's under discussed and yet so prevalent in literally everyday life. So before we kind of get into the meat of it, I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and what you do to whoever's listening today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. And again, for me, it's been a long time coming as well. So I'm Emily. I'm a holistic counsellor. I'm based in New Zealand, but I work with anyone around the world. So my niche that I work in is relationship anxiety, which is a topic very dear to my heart, and it definitely has not been spoken enough about in the world. And I've found in my line of work that people have gone to lots of counsellors seeking help, and then people don't understand what this is. So they're seeking help for something, but they're not getting it. So that's where I come in, and other practitioners as well that do something similar to me.
So I'm always curious to know a little bit more about how you ended up in the line of work that you're doing now. Has it always been an innate interest that you've had, or how did that all come about for you?
Yeah. So counseling itself as a whole has always been an interest to me. But then when I got married, I started to see a whole lot of stuff within myself that was coming up in my relationship, and I didn't understand what it was. I'm like, why do I feel this way? What's going on? And I felt quite isolated. I didn't really talk to friends about it. And I actually just started doing research, and I came across people that niched out in what now I am niched out in. I'm like, okay, something exists that makes so much sense, but nobody's talking about it. So I went to uni, learnt so much about attachment stuff, and that's where I started to become more and more passionate, because I studied originally social work, and at that stage they make you do so much inner work. But I was younger, and I thought, I'm securely attached, but I didn't have a partner. So I didn't understand the kind of inner wounding that I did have that then came out in marriage. And when I went and did a post-grad kind of study, that was when I'm like, okay, there's actually stuff here that makes sense. And again, why is no one talking about it? So everyone talks about attachment, which is really awesome, but not many people were talking about relationship anxiety or relationship OCD.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I feel like you've hit the nail on the head here. And I just want to outline very quickly for the people that are have heard bits and pieces but aren't really too sure. Today, what intrigued me so much about you and why I wanted to have you on is, again, whether it's me personally or friends, just conversations that you have with your girlfriends in your 20s of people trying to navigate these growing serious relationships, and for in a lot of ways discovering yourself for the first time in those relationships, and whether it is a serious one or you're single or whatever. I feel like a lot of these things come up for people, and when you don't have someone validating what you're feeling and explaining to you where that comes from, it is very scary. And I think a lot of people can find themselves in that kind of a situation right now, whether they're in a happy relationship or not. Which is why I felt it's so important to open up kind of this topic that I have never really discussed on the podcast before. So I'm super excited. And from my understanding of relationship anxiety, it really does all stem from your attachment. So for people that have never taken a psychology class, this is brand new to them. They're like, what the heck are you talking about? Can you briefly describe what your attachment style is and why it's important to know that?
Yeah. So an attachment style is how you basically attach and connect with your primary caregiver. So could be mom, could be dad, whoever was the main person that looked after you. And it's not, one thing I always like to preface is it's not the person's fault. Like, it's not our parents' fault or caregiver's fault that we didn't necessarily attach securely, because everyone's doing their best. That's kind of what I like everyone to remember. But our parents might have been intending to connect with us, but for whatever reason, our own nervous system or child baby brain was interpreting it as we're not getting what we need. So we could be crying and just need comfort, but that's not met in the moment. And slowly we learn, okay, my needs aren't being met. How am I going to respond to it? And then it starts showing up in adult life as we grow up. So somebody might be anxiously attached. So if they feel like someone's pulling away from them, they start to try cling on even more. And then somebody might be avoidantly attached. So if somebody's connecting with them, it freaks them out and they pull away. And then often in romantic relationships, the anxious and avoidant seem to be drawn to each other. Yeah. And I see that as a way, like a modality of healing, because you've both got the same wound of not being securely attached. But if you start learning about your attachment, you can heal it. Anyone can become securely attached. And then people can also swing between anxious and avoidant, and that can show up in relationships. So one relationship, you might be quite anxious with the person, and then you're in another relationship and suddenly you're quite avoidant, and it can be a bit confusing. And then securely attached people often have a more calm nervous system. Doesn't mean they don't get dysregulated, but their needs were met more frequently, their emotional needs. So the securely attached person in a relationship, if somebody is acting strangely or not giving them their needs, they can quite easily say, okay, well, you're not giving my needs. You can have a conversation about it. And if nothing changes, then they're confident enough to leave. Yeah. But they're anxious and avoidant. It's a bit more murky.
Yeah, I understand. And I think, because just like for context, like I did take a few psychology classes in college, so I'm familiar with the different attachment styles. But one thing that I think, obviously it was an introductory course, it was not anything like in the realm of relationships, but one thing that kind of stuck out to me is how, like, often, obviously, we're quick to try and, like, categorize ourselves into one of these when learning about them. And one of the things that wasn't quite so obvious to me at the beginning, and I feel like with time has become more clear, is that because of the way that these different attachment styles are described, right, it's very, like, black or white. And it's very, like, it's kind of like, not extreme, the examples that they use to like categorize you, but like they make it stark enough so that you can easily like see the differences. But I find that some of the time, like you're quick to assume, kind of like you said earlier, that you're securely attached because it doesn't, the way that you as an adult perceive your childhood does not line up, I guess, with either anxious or avoidant. And can you talk a little bit about how, although you might not, I'm trying to like express this properly, it's clear in my head, but let me backtrack to my example. So in my case, I'm sitting here in this class and I'm trying to determine which one of these I am. And as an adult, the way that I've perceived my childhood is like, oh, well, of course I'm securely attached because my childhood doesn't fit into either one of these like other buckets. However, much to your point, sometimes the way you've perceived it isn't actually what happened in the moment. So is there a spectrum for people? Can they be like a little bit of in between without being necessarily in those buckets? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. It can, right? It's murky. I like the word murky. Definitely, you can be somewhat secure or on the journey to security, but then still have like those anxious sides show up or those avoidant sides, or kind of crisscrossing between both. And it's so important to have that, what we perceive. Obviously, grows up in a really chaotic, abusive environment, then that's completely different.
Yeah.
But for, you know, a lot of us who it's like, well, my parents are great and I had a great childhood. But then the more we go into things, the more we can see the unconscious mind of what's been going on and how that's ruling us in relationships. If that answers it.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was trying to get at. A lot of these is the first time I've voiced it out loud. So like I'm thinking and processing as I'm sharing. And before we move into like what this can bring about in like adult relationships, why would you encourage people to take some time to like recognize maybe or analyze where they're at along this spectrum? Why is it important for us to know that?
Yeah, I think it's really important because the more the more you're in a relationship, so you can do the work whether you're in one or out of one and start kind of looking into it. But it's important to do the work or look into it and understand it, because it's going to show up, whether you know it or not. So if you start looking into it, you can be aware, like, okay, I didn't realize, but I might have these tendencies. And then in partnership, you can talk to the person that you're with and say, hey, well, the hope is you can have open communication, right? Because that's a healthy relationship. Hey, I seem to have these tendencies and I'd like to become aware of these more and more. So in the relationship, can you gently call me out if you notice that? For example, if you're an anxious attacher and you're always messaging your partner, where are you? What are you doing? You feel anxious when they're apart from you. Your partner can say, hey, I love you. You're safe. Just to remind you, like, it's okay. And maybe you need some reassurance for a while. But the main thing is, you know your attachment style, you start doing work, and then slowly, less and less, you actually need that reassurance.
Yeah. And is there, I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm curious, but is there, and I guess this kind of gets into never mind, I'm going to save this question for later because it gets into the like relationship anxiety, and I want to make sure to go like step by step for people. So before we get into relationship anxiety, can you describe a little bit how these attachment styles kind of can manifest themselves in an adult relationship? So someone who's maybe sitting here right now, okay, I don't know what my attachment style is. What are the behaviors that maybe are generally the ones popping up that kind of can guide you to one or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm mainly just sticking with the more insecure attachment styles. So just going to talk about anxious, avoidant, and then the disorganized attachment is the swing between both. But so if somebody's avoidant, the kind of things that you can look out for in yourself or look out for in your partner, but mainly, ultimately, we have to do our own work. But avoidant tendencies could be, I like to think of it, Gen Z lingo. It's almost like, okay, when my partner is trying to connect with me, I'm kind of getting the ick. You're like, oh, they want to cuddle, and I've always wanted to cuddle them, but now that they want to cuddle, I don't actually really feel like doing it. Or I usually want to go on a date, but for some reason I'm starting to feel like, oh, maybe I'm going to start avoiding that. Basically, it's just anything you're trying to avoid, and the main thing you're trying to avoid is connection.
And it can be both physical and emotional, right? Like it can just as much be like a physical, intimate moment as it is like an emotional, like long, deep conversation or something.
A deep conversation or even fun. You could suddenly, oh, I actually don't even want to have fun with you anymore, or something's feeling uncomfortable. And it's not, it's manifesting and showing up as like not wanting to connect with your partner. But actually, it's kind of, if you sit in the moment and try to understand, okay, what's going on, often it's a feeling of like not feeling safe and calm internally. And you kind of put it in the connection you have with him.
Understood. Okay. So that's more the avoidant. And then what would an anxiously attached person, what are the behaviors that manifest?
So for an anxious attachment person, it's that same thing. You are wanting connection, but almost everything you start doing is too much, and it can scare scare your partner a little bit, especially if it's an avoidant partner. But so the anxious person might be like, it's overthinking absolutely everything, not always absolutely everything, but all the actions of your partner. So it's like, oh, I noticed when I put my hand on their knee in the car, they kind of like moved their knee a bit. What does that mean? And you start overthinking it. Or I noticed when I kissed them, they made a weird noise. Like, it can be the tiniest, but you start to overthink it. And then because you're noticing it and it's making you anxious because are they pulling away, which they might not be at all, but you're perceiving it as that. And then you start to try to connect more and more and more.
That makes total sense. And I'm giggling because I see myself in all of these things. And so now it's funny thinking back. And
that's note as well as myself. I'm like, one of the main reasons I know this, yes, it's through study, but personal experience. So I'm like, I'm working with people, but I'm not sitting here of like, oh, I'm this enlightened being. I'm just like, I get it. And it's really uncomfortable. Yeah.
And is there like, obviously, like I've dived into this a little bit. So like I've kind of done a little bit of the start of the work, I guess. And I'm curious to know, and this might be like way too deep of a question for the audience, but I'm curious. So I figure if I'm curious, someone else might be. How does the way that we were attached to our parents, so say someone was securely attached in childhood, or so like they think, okay, as of yet, and then they like have their first 1-2 like more serious relationships, okay, and those end in a way that wasn't good, right? And whether just not good, okay? And obviously everyone knows, like you have your first breakup, it hurts, and it leaves you broken in certain ways, and depending how it happened. Do your first like romantic relationships, I guess all of them really, do they have the potential to damage that attachment style? Do they tend to like reinforce you a certain way if you were already that way, or can it have the potential to like completely, take you in another category? Does that make sense?
Yeah, such a good question and thing to note. And I didn't say it, so thank you. Yeah. So obviously our attachment, like I said, comes from our parents or primary caregiver, but then it's either reinforced or kind of swung the other way by any relationship we might have. And so that's where relationship anxiety can be brought up, actually not from maybe a tiny bit of our upbringing, but then actually because of whether it's like, let's say you were quite secure and then your first boyfriend or girlfriend was very avoidant, it started to make you more anxious. So then that's your new wounding. And so in your next relationship, you might be like, oh no, new partner is starting to pull away, or it feels like they're pulling away, but maybe they're just like having a night out with the boys or a night out with the girls. But because of that past kind of wounding, you start to swing into that, and that is now your new attachment. But the beauty of it, because that's obviously doesn't feel beautiful, but the beauty of it is it can change.
Yeah.
So again, becoming more aware of it and finding a more secure person, or finding somebody that's not as secure in their attachment, but together being so committed that no matter what, we are going to learn to be secure together.
Yeah.
I find it so hopeful.
It is hopeful. It's perfect. And I'm glad we like closed that off with that. Before we get into like what relationship anxiety, what relationship OCD is, I feel like for people that like are listening right now and have never thought about this before, we've been kind of referencing that you've got to do the work. But I would love to know, like, concretely, it's not going to be the same for everyone, and I realize that, but what does the work look like? Like, someone is sitting here, okay, like, I can tell that this is something that even if I don't have a problem, quote unquote, I would like to know more about myself in this aspect of my life. How does one do the work?
Yeah, I know, it's like the big question. And honestly, this is something I'm going to say as well. sometimes you can go to a therapist of some kind and you're talking and you're talking and you're talking, and it can almost actually be re-traumatizing. And in a way, you're trying to do the work, right? Because you're going to this person trusting like, okay, this is why I'm here, we're doing the work. But then you've got to go deeper under levels and levels and levels, because quickly saying this, you could go to a therapist and they could say, well, you know, it sounds like you two just aren't for each other. You know, if you go and you're like, I'm really anxious in my relationship, well, then why don't you just leave? You know, that's often what some therapists do. But from the line of work I'm doing, to say, what is the work? Firstly, you take the step, which is like the choice, step one of, okay, actually, something's not feeling right and I want to change it or do the work. So in my line of work, what I help people with is going deep, and it takes time, right? You can't just like go somewhere and like, boom, you've got to the root cause, but you're going deep and unraveling your unconscious beliefs, which is like your childhood kind of traumas and the way you perceive things in your life, and making sure that what we do isn't just, because it's so important to know the theories, right? And understand like, oh, this is why I do this, that's why I do that. But then if you avoid the feelings of it and like actually crying and actually getting angry and expressing your feelings, then that's when the work gets stunted, because you're just cognitively knowing it. So with relationship anxiety, what I do with my clients is I work with the body as well, because that's been an experience that I've had in my relationship. It's like something happens somatically and in my nervous system, and it's like clenched, and like learning how to release it. So that's actually one of my favorite parts of the work that I do, is helping people notice different parts and different tensions. And the more it sounds a bit wacky, but I talk to these different feelings with the people and sensations, and then it starts to their bodies. And as it moves through, often a memory might come in, or a pain point, or a deep emotion, whether it's like crying or sometimes intense laughter that then turns into crying. It's like and then it's quite a lot that I'm saying. Yeah, but
it's okay. It's perfect. I love it.
Exposing people to the things that are triggering you, because it's so easy to be like, oh, that's a trigger in my relationship. Either I'm going to leave or I'm going to completely avoid it, and noticing the avoid of it. So yeah, helping people do the things that really scare them.
I think that's great, and the whole body thing fascinates me. It's one of the things that I'm reading into, but like have never done personally myself. But I find that to be very encouraging for some people, because I feel like in a lot of like the self-help world and everything, you get told feel your feelings, but like how, you know? So I love that you provide that, and you give that as an example, and just like for like more context, is this something like that approach? Obviously, like the cognitive piece is something you can talk to, you know, multiple people about, hopefully with people you trust and who are like equipped to help you properly. But this more somatic body stuff, is it something that someone needs to do with the guidance of a professional, or are there ways that we can kind of implement that ourselves at home?
I would say to start with, so you kind of start learning like, the how-to. It's quite helpful to have somebody hold the space for you, because during sessions, it's like a co-regulation, because, you know, we often don't know how to regulate our emotions, regulate our nervous system. So when you do it with somebody through like, so if I'm working with a client, I'm using my own regulation, my nervous system, to support them in regulating theirs. So beautiful interwoven kind of thing, but it's with the goal of teaching them these techniques to then go into their own life. And let's say, like a common experience for people is if they're feeling something in their throat, can start to get that closed up feeling. So it's like, get this, what do I do? And my thing is often there's like a message that it's trying to communicate to you, and you can start understanding and talking to these parts that close up and tighten and know their purpose. And it's kind of IFS, internal family systems work, where we all have these internal parts within us, and normally that's talking into the mind. But then we also have these physical parts that are telling us stories of wounding. Yeah.
This
so you
is
can
fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop myself there because I feel like I could just keep going on this topic, but I know that it's not the most relevant for everyone. So I will continue chatting with you about this offline later. So that kind of leads me into, okay, so we're getting conversations, we're doing this kind of somatic healing, there's other aspects to it. I want to now like get really into the bulk of your line of work, which is relationship anxiety, relationship OCD. I think for the first time, just like to put people into context and you into context, like this word was so like mind-blowing to me, and I tell you that because I didn't even know that it was a thing. You know, like the first time I discovered it was actually through a friend who, you know, was going through her own personal things, and she was coming to me with all of these, like her relationship anxiety and the thoughts that she was having, and like hers manifested perhaps differently than mine did, but it was kind of eye-opening when she discovered that she had this through the help of working with a professional. It's like, whoa, like this is a whole different thing that I didn't even know existed. And I think that might be the case for a lot of people. So I would love to hear from you, what is relationship anxiety? And then we'll kind of get into relationship OCD. I know they're kind of intertwined, but for the sake of keeping it clear, start with relationship anxiety.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And it's really brave that your friend started opening you. Again, this is why conversations are so important, because then we can realize, oh, that's an experience that some people have. So relationship anxiety can manifest in different ways. But basically, when you connect with your partner, all kinds of fears and anxieties can start coming up. And I find it really hard, if I'm being honest, to kind of differentiate between relationship anxiety and relationship OCD because they are so intertwined.
You can go ahead and share them simultaneously if you want, then.
Yeah, that's okay. I kind of share them one of the same thing, but sometimes I feel like it can be easier for people to use the term relationship anxiety than relationship OCD because it can feel a bit less intimidating.
Yeah, for sure.
So basically, when we're in a relationship, anybody, whether you have relationship anxiety or relationship OCD or not, we all have thoughts, right? Like we can be sitting with a partner and you can think to yourself, I'm not that attracted to you. And for most people, if they are not experiencing relationship anxiety, they just notice it and be like, I am just not that attracted to you, but kind of it doesn't really mean anything. You're not attaching a meaning to it. You just notice that and then you move on. Whereas if you have relationship anxiety, you notice that, but it's like, holy crap, I'm not attracted to my partner. And you start going over and over, well, what does that mean? Have I ever been attracted to them? Does it mean we need to break up? Does it mean I'm better than them? Just like it spirals and spirals. And that's more the kind of side, because OCD is a lot of rumination and you're just ticking along. And it's not just about attraction. It can be pretty much any thought, but a lot of relationship anxiety stems from watching movies, right? Movies, TV shows, just pop culture. You see all these perfect relationships. We're always into somebody and there's fireworks and, you know, you're having sex and the sheet just slowly like goes over you guys. It's all intimate and beautiful, but it's not reality. So then when you are in a relationship, it can, if you've built that idea, it's confusing. Yeah. And so you start to think, oh, okay, well, when I have sex with my partner, it doesn't feel like that. So something must be wrong. And you can start avoiding intimacy. Or when you are being intimate, you can check, am I attracted to them? Does this feel good? Doesn't mean I need to leave. If like, oh, that didn't feel good, something must be wrong. It's just this constant ticking in a spiral. And to share where it's quite bizarre when I think about it, but a noticeable thing that was happening to me. My mind was latching on to, so my partner and I, we got married, moved into this small home, and I bought these photo frames to put our wedding pictures in.
Mm-hmm.
For about a year, I left empty photo frames on the wall, and people would see it, my friends, and be like, come on, Emily, just like put the photo in there.
Mm-hmm.
But not, there was so much going on in my mind of, but if I put a photo in there, does this mean that this is forever? But really what was happening was I was so anxious that if I put the photo up, and there's almost no logic to it, but if I put my wedding photos up, well, what if he leaves? And then he leaves, and then I have to take the photo off my wall. And like, it just made me so anxious. And that's kind of what I wasn't aware of what was going on in my brain. Yeah.
No, and I appreciate you sharing that, because it's through, like, again, I mean, we said it earlier, but it's through the sharing of these experiences that you can recognize. I want to be like very careful of how I like describe this, but when we think of what, I don't want to use the word normal, because there's no such thing as like normal versus abnormal, but to know, I guess, that you don't have to be in that kind of a spiral, I guess, and you can, like, there exists a way in which you can feel better about it and more secure and not, like, re-questioning your entire relationship every 2 days. And so it's so important to share those things. And so when people, I guess, like, even from my personal life, I was going to ask you why it's important to know why it's important to know it. And I mean, I can attest to that. Like, I think I can imagine, and this might not be true for everyone, but I found that, like, while I might not be the most relationship anxious, I definitely, like, have had my baggage that brought me to this, like, now relationship that I am in. And, like, on paper, like, it's perfect, right? Like, there's no reason, there's no reason to leave. There's no reason to, like, it's great, you know, and like, but these kind of like anxious thoughts and these spirals like made me re-question and like very seriously, like nearly made me back out of this like perfectly fine relationship, right? Because of these doubts and these questions that you ask yourself, and is he really the one, and all of these things. And so I feel like it's so important to like talk about that, because like whoever's listening right now is like, oh gosh, this is me. Well, you're not alone, I guess, is the point.
And it's a very isolating experience.
It is isolating. And I'd love to hear, just like kind of like in this spirit of like reassuring people that might be discovering that they have this for the very first time, like how common is it, right? I think when we're in these situations, we feel like, oh, I must be the only one, which is really not true. How common is relationship anxiety?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks for sharing some of your story there, because I can only imagine there's like pain involved in it, right? Like we can talk about these things almost so, I don't know what the word is, but it's just like, oh yeah, I experienced it, no big deal. But it's like, no, it comes with a heck of a lot of pain.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
Now I just forgot your question for a second.
Is it common? The question was it common? Is it more common than we think?
Yes. Well, I'm going to say yes, it is, because so when my husband and I were going on our journey, we each had our own experiences, and I talk about mine because it's like my story to share, and I leave him to share his own story. Mm-hmm. But as I opened up to people, some friends, some family members, almost like, what the heck, you know, like a bit judgmental. So it makes you think, okay, there is something wrong with me, or there is something wrong with my relationship. But if you also start talking to people and just being more open, you start to hear your friends' stories and your friends' thought. You're like, okay, maybe they don't have OCD with it, but maybe they're quite anxious with it. And I guess I don't have statistics. And when I talk to most people, so many people are so unaware of it. But then if you start entering, as soon as you've entered into this world, especially online, you start to see pages. I'm talking about social media, pages of people talking about experience. And then on their pages, you see, I mean, I'm small still, a really small page, but you see hundreds of thousands of people. So I'm like, okay, this is a thing. It's not nobody experiencing.
No, absolutely.
But it's more than we realize. And even putting my service out there and having people reach out to a page which is tiny, I'm like, okay, people are seeking help. People need this. So yeah, it's a thing.
Absolutely. And I think I'm kind of gearing this back to how like we can best use this conversation to help, I guess, the audience members that are listening and maybe having discoveries, maybe they knew and just didn't have the words to describe what it was they were feeling. But I found that one of the hardest parts for me, as kind of, it sounds kind of similar to your situation in the sense that you realize that you had this for the first time in a happy, serious relationship. And one of the hardest things that I found in all of this, outside of just understanding what it was opening up about it to my partner and sharing and describing it in a way that doesn't make you sound completely insane for someone that like doesn't experience the same thing. And so do you have any, like, obviously depends on the situation, but do you have any kind of general advice for people that are kind of in that boat or soon to be in that boat after this episode that you can share?
Yeah. So it definitely, just to say to anyone listening, if they're feeling like, oh, I think this is me. It's really, it can feel, it might not be, but it can feel really scary. Like, oh my gosh, if I tell my partner this, it could, like, the thoughts come in, right? What if it ends this relationship that I actually don't want to end? But my biggest kind of thing is relationships. The foundation should always be built on like open and honest communication. So yes, you don't need to tell your partner every thought that you've had, because you know, right, that some things are really going to hurt somebody if you say whatever it might be, that like, I keep thinking your eyelids are really huge, whatever it might be. Your eyelids are huge. Well, actually your partner doesn't need to know that. But just explaining to your partner something like, hey, I've become aware of, or I finally have words and a title to what I've been experiencing. And getting up a page, whether it's like mine, Secure Love Co., or there's a whole bunch online of a whole bunch of resources that I can give to you as well at the end with them, of like kind of almost going through a list of like, this is what it is. And it doesn't need to be like, because then you're almost depersonalizing it as well. It's just like, this is the go through what it is. And then the invite, this is what I see it as. It's an invite for you and your partner to start doing the work. Because if one of you is experiencing it, chances are your partner has their own different kind of experience. And it might not be the same, but it's this invitation for both of you to go really deep and heal. And so if you're willing and if your partner's willing, it could be like the most beautiful thing to actually reconnect you guys on a deeper level than you had before. I would encourage talking about it and inviting them in the journey with you.
Yes, and just like a little heads up for people that are going to try this, it's not going to, if you have a good understanding open partner, it ends well. So I hope you have different experiences. I did, but it ends well. There's good understanding people out there. I think one of the questions, go ahead, sorry.
Also giving your partner grace for how they react, because it might and throw them off. But then give them some time to kind of simmer down, reflect internally. So trying to prep yourself to show them grace for their response as well. Because you have had time to prep them about it as well. And I'm really glad you had a good experience as well.
That's a really good piece of advice. I think one of the questions I had asked my friend if she had any like specific questions that she wanted me to ask you in light of this conversation today. And she brought to me the fact that it was very difficult at certain points in her relationship anxiety journey to differentiate between the anxious spiraling thoughts and actual important questions and doubts about a relationship. How do we distinguish the two?
Yeah. Again, going back to the word, it's murky, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely a thing of learning. And you might sometimes, not that anything's wrong, but you might get confused sometimes between the two. But one thing that's helpful is to realize your true values. Like, what are your actual values? Because with relationship anxiety or relationship OCD, it's ego dystonic, which often means it goes against your value system. So if you clearly know what your values are and what you're kind of aiming for in your relationship, that's when you can start distinguishing between the two. And with anxiety or OCD, it can become really confusing with what's your gut instinct telling you. Because, you know, I'm a true believer that we all have instinct and gut intuition. We can tap into it. But if you've got anxiety, it can be really helpful if you have somebody that you know and trust and that understands OCD and relationship anxiety to help guide you through it. Because otherwise it just is like, treading through murky water. You don't know what's you don't know what's the anxiety. So the main thing is just knowing your values and also knowing it's okay to have questions and it's okay to look at those. But if you're, it's kind of noticing, before you know what relationship anxiety is, if you're researching, right, you're constantly kind of looking up like, oh, I feel this about my partner, Dr. Google, what does this mean? What does that mean? You can't trust yourself. You've already started to lose trust and disconnection with your intuition. If that makes sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And I think like I empathize with the people that are living through this right now because it's definitely like not an easy place to find yourself in. But I agree with you that having someone that you can kind of like know you can trust to be open and honest with and like get genuine feedback and kind of either in certain cases like validate what you're feeling, but also say, hey, I think you'd regret making X decision if you acted on this anxious thought, as opposed to like, no, I think that's a genuine like doubt that you're having. I agree that is like so helpful. As friends to people that have relationship anxiety, whether they know it or not, if we're a friend that's supporting someone that's kind of like showing kind of signs of this, whether they're aware of it or not, like how can we best support them in those situations?
Yeah. It's a really good question as well because so many people don't know about it. And so, people's responses actually are huge when it comes to relationship anxiety because it can either exacerbate the symptoms or soothe them and ease it. So you can start noticing in your friend if they're seeking reassurance from you, like, oh, do you think this is actually my person, or do you think that we're actually a good couple? Or just kind of constantly, if your friend's always asking you those kind of questions, and you might be aware they're kind of on this cycle, they're almost on a loop, and you can start calling it out like, oh, hey, I'll just use a random name as an example. Hey, like I notice you keep asking me this, and I think, like, let's say you've been together for 5 years. I'm not going to feed into this anxiety with you. I'm here for you and, like, I love you. But it sounds like you're really anxious. How can we help calm that anxiety down versus, like, oh, yeah, that did happen. And, yeah, maybe it's not right. Like kind of just feeding into it. It's just, no relationship's perfect. But obviously, if your friend's in a bad relationship, that's different. Yeah. But if it's more anxiety, then calling it out and not going on that cycle with them.
No, I think that's super helpful. Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Is there, before I kind of transition into like my outro general questions, is there anything that I did not ask about that anyone should like know before ending this episode?
Let me think. This is one thing actually that I find so fascinating and then so frustrating as well. But this is more like, yes, it's anxiety, but it's also quite OCD related, and people that have OCD in general, and then it goes into the relationship OCD kind of realm is that OCD gaslights us, and we start to believe, oh, no, I don't have OCD, or no, that's not my experience. It kind of makes you doubt everything. So even if you're on the journey of healing, you might start to have those thoughts of like, no, that's not actually me. And again, trying to connect back into like your true self versus that anxious self that's coming in, because really it's just anxiety and fear coming in again, saying like, that's not your experience. You're not really going through that. So yeah. And another thing is looking into but this is part of the work stuff, is looking into your past and starting to notice where anxiety has shown up in other areas of your life, where it may be shown up in other areas of your life, to start to notice, okay, it might not be just this. Yeah. But the anxiety and OCD is telling me it's the relationship that's wrong. It's the relationship that's causing me all this pain. I've got to get out. Yeah.
No, for sure. And I think that's a great thing to end on. So I have a few just kind of more general questions that I kind of ask every guest that run along the lines of the main theme of the podcast. So as we touched on briefly at the beginning, obviously one of the big things that I love talking about and has been kind of on topic for the entire episode today is mental health. And I'm always curious to know what the guest in particular does to take care of their mental health. So what are the things that you do kind of a daily, weekly basis to take care of your mental health?
Yeah. Well, I love that. Obviously, that's also holds me accountable, right? Because I'm like, I work. So I have my own therapist that I've been seeing for nearly a year now. I see her weekly. So it's like I have built such a strong relationship with this lady. So therapy, myself, sometimes no shame in therapy. And I work out. I've actually started as of a week ago. So I used to do more like Pilates and bar and all of those kind of things. And everything that's gone on in my life without being, telling the world what's gone on in my relationship, I've started weightlifting because I'm like, okay, I feel like I've built strength in my mind. If I've built strength in my mind, I can build even more strength in my body and kind of show it like the connection between both. So that nature friends, just getting out there and calming my body down, because I have a nervous system that gets wired easily. So things that soothe
Amen,
that.
sister. Yeah, no, I completely understand. And I love those tips. Awesome. And my last little question for you, I have to give you a little bit of context for you to be able to answer this. But obviously the title of the podcast, or the name of the podcast, is called What Moves You. And I named it What Moves You because during my and it's still ongoing, it's not over, but my health journey and the years that were a little bit more challenging, this is one of those questions that I came back to regularly and realized that we focus on the big things, the big drivers in our life, whether those are our big passions or our careers and etc. But often we overlook the little things that we do each day, and the little joys and the little wins and the little moments that we get to experience each and every day. So I'm curious to know, whether it's on the small scale or the big scale, what moves you?
What moves me? Good question. Because it's those small moments. Okay. Well, something that on my own journey that I found really moving, and it was quite emotional almost. It's like this thing of coming to myself, but through a micro moment each day. And mine was taking myself to a cafe and ordering my single shot cappuccino, which the baristas start to know, is having like those small moments with strangers, and allowing those small moments with strangers to remind me who I am. Because that stranger has no clue, but for some reason, a micro moment, whether it's 10 seconds, can like make a world of difference. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, that seems to really have moved me and been my journey when I completely forgot who I was, lost who I was. It's like, okay, strangers kind of reminded me who I am. How can I, as a stranger, remind somebody else who they are? through just a micro little small conversation or a smile, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that's what moves me. Strangers.
I love that. It's such a cute story. I always love hearing what people have to say. Sometimes people take it real big and give you like your life motivators, and others give you the small things, and it's all very beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Emily, thank you so much once again for taking the time to chat with me today. I know this conversation was probably so eye-opening and healing and needed for so many people. So thank you so much for taking the time, and everyone listening, thank you so much for taking a small hour out of your day. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next week.